Thank you very much. Thank you, that's very generous, thank you. Last October, I published a novel for the first time for 5 years, and also realized that somehow 12 years had passed since I published my first novel back in 2003. And for the last 6 months, I've been traveling around various festivals and book events and giving various readings. And I thought I'd take this opportunity to make some observations about what's changed over that time. I wanted to begin in Germany, where my book tour started. I love reading in Germany, partly because you get to read at a literature house, and nothing makes you feel more important and intellectual than reading at a house of literature, and also because at German book events you can read for hours. I mean, just hours and hours, and no one ever said at a book reading in this country, I wish David had read for longer. But in Germany, you get a chance to just push at the limits of what an audience can take. And during the day on this tour, we'd go to bookshops, and I couldn't help but notice that even though we were entering the Christmas season, the displays were full of fiction. Literary fiction, popular fiction, short stories. In British bookshops, the Christmas market is given over to gift books, biographies of TV personalities and footballers, cookbooks, annuals, books for people who don't read much or who don't like fiction. And there's nothing wrong with that. No reason to be snobbish if people enjoy the books. And besides, in the summer in the UK, the novel is king, so isn't it all right for fiction to take a backseat in the months up to Christmas? The difference, I suppose, is that at summer we buy books for ourselves, and at Christmas we buy books for others. And isn't it strange that, with some exceptions, we seem less willing to give fiction as a gift? Buying someone a novel is a gamble. It's like playing someone your favourite song. You need them to love it. And we've all had that experience of pressing a book into someone's hand, saying, "This is wonderful. It will change your life," then hearing nothing. Is mortifying and exposing too, because the novels we love reveal something about ourselves, reflect our personalities, our experiences and outlook, our obsessions, which isn't something you can necessarily say about the Guinness Book of Records. Standing in a bookshop in Cologne, it struck me that I used to give novels to people all the time, in the same way that I used to make people mixtapes. I tried to recall the last time I bought someone a work of fiction that had moved me in the hope that it might move them, and I couldn't remember. So that was my first resolution, to give more books as gifts. From Germany, I travelled to New York, arriving on a beautiful, crisp winter's day. Resolving to stay awake, I went for a long walk, eventually ending up in a Soho bar where I took out the paperback I was carrying in my coat and began to read. And to turn the page of my paperback book, I found myself tapping the margin on the right-hand side. One light tap on the paper with my index finger. In my defense, I was jet-lagged and perhaps a little drunk by then, but even so, I was shocked to realize that after nearly half a century, I'd momentarily forgotten how paper worked. And I made another resolution to spend less time reading from screens. Over the next few days, I visited some of the bookshops in that city and played that all too familiar game, Is It Still There? There were thriving independents in Soho and Greenwich Village, and ferociously cool new shops in Brooklyn. The mighty Strand on Broadway was packed late in the evening, but others felt more forlorn and deserted, and St. Mark's bookshop, which I'd always loved, had gone, relocated to a new, smaller location further from Broadway. Back in London, I discovered that the lovely bookshop on Exmouth Market had also gone, and I felt an all-too-familiar sadness, usually accompanied by guilt, because while you're sorry the shop has gone, you're also vaguely aware that you hadn't bought anything there for a while. For all the ease and convenience of online shopping or the digital download, I still feel a town without a bookshop is missing something. I grew up in one. The only books you could buy in my hometown were those that came on a rotating stand in Woolworths, thrillers by James Hadley Chase and Alistair MacLean. And while I loved James Herbert as much as the next teenage boy, this wasn't enough, which is why the public library was so important to me, and why, when a bookshop finally arrived in our nearest city, a branch of Dillon's in the early 80s, it seemed a kind of paradise, and an education too, because browsing in bookshops introduced me to so many of the writers I love now. For much of the early 90s, I worked in bookshops myself, running the children's section in Waterstone's Notting Hill with a rod of iron, and believing, as I do today, that books are somehow special, that the expertise and enthusiasm of booksellers is vital, and that if you love bookshops, you should spend money there, and that to discover a book on display in a well-staffed, lovingly maintained shop, to hold it in your hand, then to sneak off and buy the same book online, is really just a genteel form of shoplifting. From New York, I flew to Toronto to attend a festival, one of those lively, well-attended events that belie the death of reading, and one afternoon during my stay, I visited the offices of an e-book retailer to meet the staff and talk about the new novel. They, without exception, were smart, well-read, youthful, knowledgeable, enthusiastic, and inspiring, and they reminded me of the people I used to work with in bookshops years ago. Just as I was leaving, someone asked if I'd be interested in knowing at what point people stopped reading my novel. I asked, "What do you mean?" "Well," they said, the tiny, tiny proportion of readers who abandoned the book, would I ever be interested in knowing at what point they tended to give up? Because if I knew what they didn't like, maybe I could fix it, make it better, interact. When I wrote my first novel, this would have seemed fantastical, but now I can reach into my pocket, take out my phone, open up the text and find out which passages have been underlined, shared and annotated, and I'm always just a few clicks away from several thousand reviews, constructive, positive or otherwise. Why shouldn't I, as an author, toughen up and learn from the data and the feedback? More to the point, why shouldn't I correct those mistakes? There are sentences in all my books that make me writhe in embarrassment, and isn't there something tantalizing about the possibility of fixing the joke that never quite made sense, nipping out the mixed metaphor or the glib punchline? Of course, at present, there's a problem of compatibility with the printed text, but digital texts are shifting and infinitely changeable. Could I ever take advantage of that? Or would it be as dishonest and futile as photoshopping an old school photo? I said, "Thank you." I said, "I'll give it some thought." Back in London, and the time had come to redecorate, which meant taking down books from the shelves and boxing them up. What a great opportunity to revisit much-loved volumes, and what a great way to spend a weekend re-alphabeticizing. I began to take the books down and pack them into cardboard boxes. 4 bays, 10 shelves each, approximately 75 books on each shelf. And it's no exaggeration to say by the time I'd finished the first bay, I wanted to get rid of them all. What was this sentimental attachment to these ridiculous, scruffy, dusty objects? What possible use did I have for a Marxist analysis of Jacobean drama, for the prize-winning novel that I'd wanted to throw across the room, for 6 different editions of Middlemarch, a Paris restaurant guide from 1991? In what possible circumstances might I find myself reaching for the Canterbury Tales or Ezra Pound? Wasn't this just another case of books furnishing a room? It's not even as if they were particularly lovely objects, scruffy and dusty and dog-eared. Would it really matter if they all disappeared? I was fooling myself if I thought my children were keen to inherit this mouldering pile of recycling, that they'd be fighting over who was to get that 60-year-old paperback of Barnaby Rudge. By the end of that day, I really didn't want to see those books again, and I resolved to throw the great bulk of them away. The room was redecorated. I didn't do it myself because I wanted it done well. And a week later, I started this great cull, and found, to nobody's surprise, that I couldn't do it. Instead, I found myself flicking through the pages, remembering where I'd read that novel and how I'd felt closing the cover. Essay plans, restaurant menus, postcards fell from out of the pages. I found the volume of short stories that my partner bought me on our first date, and I began to make a pile of the books I'd always meant to read, but hadn't. Yet I threw away the Ancient Restaurant Guide, and a few novels went too, but Ezra Pound and the Canterbury Tales survived, because throwing away books is as hard as throwing away photos or letters or old diaries. You don't need them, but you don't want to lose them. Which brings me to today and this event, and I suppose I should confess that I was hesitant about taking this on, because in the years since I published One Day, the debate between digital and physical has had a kind of gladiatorial flavour. On one side, the book as object, libraries and shops, traditional publishers and the literary pages, and on the other, online retail and the digital download, new models of publishing and social media, Cavaliers versus Roundheads, or perhaps more accurately, for someone of my age at least, Betamax versus VHS, with only one survivor allowed. And all too often in this debate, I felt like the proud owner of a vast collection of Betamax. My love of the book as object, and by extension of the public library and bookshop, has to do with the way stories are experienced, remembered, shared, and passed on. Irrespective of how you feel about the word gift being used as a verb, no one has yet found a way to unwrap digital data, to turn it into something you cherish, or to give online browsing the same pleasure, satisfaction, and sense of discovery as walking around a bookshop. And yes, I can see how digital forms might offer all kinds of innovations, but as a reader, I'm not sure I want a soundtrack or sound effects or illustrations or an audio commentary from the author, though I'm happy to explore all of those things once the story is over, once I've stopped reading. Neither do I want to interact with the story. When I was a child, I used to read those fantasy books where you got to decide on what happens next, and they were always, without exception, deathly. Fiction is about telling. I like to be told. I want the author to know better than me, even if the story makes me sad or frustrated or angry. I want a book to be fixed black marks on a white background, simultaneously so little and so much. Of course, I realize that hovering over all of this is the L word, Luddite. But it should be remembered that the Luddites weren't simply against technology. They were for social justice and a fair deal. And when bookshops, independent or otherwise, are under threat from ruthless and predatory competition, then it's hard to discard those old allegiances. And yet, in other ways, I can feel this hard line softening, concede that it's neither tenable nor desirable. As I've said, much of my reading time has shifted to the screen. And more often than not now, I buy the physical and digital versions of the same book, and this seems to me a fair compromise. As someone who travels, as an insomniac with poor eyesight, I'm grateful for the low glow of the screen in the middle of the night. Yes, it sends me crazy that the moment I finish an e-book, I'm immediately tapped on the shoulder and asked to give it stars, marks out of 5, because God forbid we should have an opinion that goes unshared or a complicated response. And yet, as an author, I value those 4- and 5-star responses when I'm lucky enough to get them, knowing how important online reviews can be in spreading the word, and appreciate the passion and enthusiasm of book bloggers and tweeters. I avoid social media myself, partly because I have the thinnest of skins, partly because I think that constant feedback, even when positive, especially when positive, can be a distraction, and partly because I'd actually like to write another book at some point. But I understand its value for new and emerging writers, and I admire and am slightly envious of authors who've acquired that skill and used it, not just to promote themselves, but the work of others. And while I love to see someone holding a copy of one of my books, or even better to hear that they've passed it on to someone else, I'm delighted too to know that a book has been downloaded, and don't much mind if the black marks, the white background, are on a paper or a screen, as long as the words are read and enjoyed. As I said, it's been 5, nearly 6 years now since I published my last novel, and at that time I remember thinking that I'd better hurry up and write another, because before long there might be no books left, and certainly nowhere to sell them. That hasn't happened. And I suppose what I hope for now, and what these observations have been leading to, is some kind of equilibrium, a kind of peaceful coexistence, the survival, perhaps even the resurgence of books and bookshops, alongside the continuing success and evolution of digital forms. A thriving community of readers meeting at festivals and fairs alongside a noisy, opinionated, but generally positive and passionate online community. As a fortune teller, my qualifications are non-existent, but what I hope for is a thriving, growing passion for those marks on the page, whether that page is on paper or screen. Thank you very much.